So, for so these type A, B, C physicalisms and stuff, it sounds like if people know what that means, and maybe I'll just say sort of what they are generally
Yeah,
and
if you
then
could go
answer the
over them really
question.
quickly for others, yeah.
So it really depends. It's all relative to the way David Chalmers sets the problem up. So, you have this general explanatory argument that says, physics explains structure and function. Consciousness is not a structure or functional property, so physics doesn't explain it. And then you can sort of give examples, and you say, well, what do you mean? People say, well, the zombies and inverts, and okay, so you have all these Case Mary in her room, right? You have all these thought experiments which tug at you in various ways, and so Chalmers introduces a kind of the terminology of the hard problem to kind of get at these kind of problematic cases. And maybe we're cheating a little bit by putting it this way, but this is one way of thinking about what's going on: is that consciousness doesn't seem like it's associated with a functional or structural property, because it seems like whatever those properties were, you're going to ask this coherent question, well, but why are they associated with this conscious experience as opposed to another one? Or why, how do I know that my seeing red isn't like you're seeing yellow, even though we're behaviorally all the same? So if you really can have those kind of inverted cases, and if there really is a question about, how is it possible that you can have uh, this very same physical state but not have the conscious experience, then so that's the hardness of the hard problem, is exactly this idea that there doesn't seem to be a functional profile associated with consciousness. And then you can kind of give these cases as some evidence for it. So the easy problems, according to Chalmers, are the problems about how you store information, how memory works, how attention works. And so we can say, well, attention is just amplification of a neural signal, and that's part of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is sending signals that amplify these ones from the visual cortex. Aha, there's attention. And so there doesn't. I mean, that's a kind of sketch of a theory about attention and how it's controlled, but you get the, and it may not be right, but you get the idea that there doesn't seem to be a problem in principle there, saying how information is stored or how attention works or how memory works, until you bring in consciousness. And so that's the hard problem of consciousness. And that the ABC stuff is all categorized in response to how you feel about this hard problem. So the type A people are typically represented as saying, well, there is no hard problem. We can tell right now what consciousness is. It's just a brain process or a functional property, and there's no issue about it. Mary can know in her room what it's like to see red. And so people like Dennett are most closely associated with this type A position, although Dennett's very clever and it's all not 100% clear what his real views are. But anyway, so that's a kind of prototypical example of that. The type A people say no hard problem at all. There's all just easy problems, and they're working on the science. So the type B people say, well, look, these identities are postulated sort of after the fact. They're what Kripke called a posteriori necessities. They're things that we only found out from experience, but once we know they're true, we know that they're necessarily true. Just like water is H2O, it was something we found out from experience. And now, since water is H2O and identities are necessary, we know this is a necessary fact, but we found out about it empirically. So those are the type B people. And then there are the type C people who, as you were saying, say, well, look, the science isn't at a state right now where it can answer these questions, but in the future it may be. And so, Thomas Nagel is a kind of classic guy who has influenced a lot of type C people, and he gave the example of like traveling back to time and meeting Socrates and trying to explain relativity physics or quantum mechanics to Socrates. And he's not a dumb guy, obviously. Socrates is a genius, probably. But he wouldn't be able to understand what you were telling him. And certainly, even if he could understand it, he wouldn't know why it was true, because he just doesn't have the right concepts. Or just like there are things that you need to understand like what's going on in relativity theory. You need to understand like non-Euclidean geometry, for example. And he doesn't have any understanding of that. So you'd be sort of wasting your time doing it. And so the idea is, well, maybe that's the position that we're in right now. Maybe the fact is that some future neuroscience will be able to answer these questions, but we can't understand how it could do so now. And that's what generates the kind of thing that you were saying, I think, that this seems sort of like a wishy-washy sort of thing. And what
Yeah,
Chalmers has done
kind
is
of
to argue that,
half-hearted.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, so Chalmers has actually tried to argue that you, at this point, you either end up being a type A or type B in the long run, so that the same arguments apply. Like either what your position has to be, according to him, is that, oh, in the future we'll learn that consciousness is really a functional or structural property, and then we'll be type A people, or we'll learn that we just have to postulate these identities or something like that, and then we'll be type B people. But that ultimately, what either one of those options, there's no other option, he thinks, and so you're going to be one of those. And so the same arguments apply in the type C thing doesn't really work.
Yeah,
So,
I,
but
I agree that you're gonna, type C people will eventually resolve into type A or type B depending on how the science goes. Yeah, that makes sense. But
okay.
I
So
was just
if you think that though,
Mhm.
then Chalmers thinks that all the same arguments apply, right? It's just they, so you'd have to deal with all the same objections, and so you can still do the arguments and everything just as well. But there are people who don't think that that's the case. So it's not clear to me that
Oh,
those are the
really?
only two options.
Hmm.
And so that's the problem here, is that if you're trying to sort of imagine what a scientific, I mean, how can someone predict using the tools of ancient Greece what quantum mechanics would look like? They can't really, because there's no way to picture it. Even now, obviously, the math of quantum mechanics has all kinds of interpretations and so forth. So it's not clear how science will progress. And there's a kind of optimistic meta induction, I think, that you can kind of perform here. And so you kind of look at the history of science, and what you see is a history of people coming to figure out ways in which things which previously presented as not scienceable, not subject to the study by science, became so. And of course, consciousness could be special, and it may resist that, and that's
This
certainly
is kind of
possible.
and this is kind of like appealing almost a little bit to like two-dimensionalism, where we've created these conceptual frameworks that even allow us to do science about these things in the first place, where we couldn't even, where it was kind of just a conceptual endeavor, was not an empirical endeavor before that conceptual framework.
Yeah, I think that's a good question too. Is like, before the scientists can do the work, the philosophers need to do the work. They need to, of
Yeah,
course,
yeah,
some people dispute that and would say, no, you just jump in and just do the science. But I do think that, yeah, that
yeah.
you have a background theory, whether you know it or not. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying, but
So onto the weightiness issue. So you're saying, okay, so if I'm arguing physicalism versus dualism or whatever, there should be no shame in me, appealing to like type A or type B style physicalist arguments. It's just to always keep it in the back of my head that there are at least some kind of IOUs here and there. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, there are definitely IOUs here and there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the IOUs are cashed in by this kind of meta induction over the history of science. That in general, this is a
Yeah,
trend that we've
I
seen as we get better theories. And so some people are going to look at this debate and say, look, here's the problem, is that you have one group of people who say, look, we can't give you a theory about what consciousness is. You know it if you see it. Or it's like jazz, right? It's like, if you got to ask, you're never going to know. That's a famous quote from Louis Armstrong that Bloch likes to quote a lot of times when people talk about consciousness. And he says, look, if we can't say anything useful about consciousness. We just have it, and we know it when we have it. And so there are people out there who think that that's the problem, is how we set it up from the starting point, because we've already assumed at that point that no theory is going to ever be revealing about the nature of consciousness, because we sort of started off saying no theory could ever reveal the nature of consciousness. So the alternative view would be, look, what we need is a good theory about what consciousness is, and then that's going to help us with some of these other questions. And notice that's different than in the animal case, which we were talking about, because there it was the theory was a theory of the implementation of consciousness. Like how does the theory that we think is correct get implemented in these other systems, and what counts as an implementation of it versus just almost but not close enough in implementation. So that's a different kind of issue. But here we're talking about getting clear about what consciousness itself is, not how it's physically implemented, but just its psychological nature, and using that as a way of trying to figure out these other questions.